In the far reaches of New England, where fog swallows the coastline and the forests whisper with secrets older than any living memory, the Whitmore family carved their name into the soil of Maine. Their story did not begin with grandeur, nor with respectability, but with something more sinister, an inheritance steeped in blood, silence, and shadows. The year was 1812. America was caught in the tremors of a war against the British crown, but in a secluded stretch of wilderness, untouched by the chaos of politics, a different war simmered, one that would never be chronicled in patriotic songs or schoolhouse recitations. It was here, along the jagged coastline near Goldsboro, that the first whispers of the Whitmore curse began. Jonathan Whitmore arrived from Boston with his young wife, Eleanor, carrying with him both wealth and arrogance. To the townsfolk, he appeared a man of promise, educated, with the kind of stern presence that commanded obedience. Yet those who looked longer than courtesy allowed saw something troubling in his gaze, a restless hunger, a calculating watchfulness, as though every face he met was not a neighbor, but a specimen. Eleanor, in contrast, was soft-spoken, refined, and pale as porcelain, her delicate beauty the sort that drew pity rather than envy. But there was a hollowness in her eyes, a fragility that seemed to worsen the longer she lived in her husband's shadow. The Whitmores purchased a sprawling estate of dense forest and rocky soil, land most locals dismissed as cursed. Old Wabanaki tales warned of spirits that lingered in the granite cliffs, of strange lights flickering in the trees, and of voices that lured hunters astray. Such stories were common enough in Maine, where survival required belief in things unseen. But Jonathan Whitmore scoffed at superstition. He was a man of science, or so he claimed, and he dismissed the native warnings as primitive nonsense. The mansion he built stood unlike anything in the surrounding settlements, a massive stone house, its walls blackened by local granite, its windows narrow, its corridors strangely uneven as though purposefully designed to confuse. Locals whispered it was more fortress than home, a fortress meant to keep something in rather than intruders out. From its very foundation, the estate seemed hostile to the living. Within months of the family's arrival, rumors began to swirl. Carpenters spoke of rooms sealed behind false walls. Laborers claimed they had been asked to dig chambers into the bedrock beneath the house, chambers reinforced with iron, their purpose never explained. One mason swore he had seen chains affixed to the stone floors, but when he spoke in the tavern, he was warned into silence by Jonathan's icy stare. By the winter of 1813, Eleanor Whitmore had grown sickly, her once bright voice dwindling to a whisper. The townsfolk saw less and less of her, until her presence became a memory more than a reality. Jonathan, however, thrived. His wealth expanded, though no one could ever say from what. He conducted no trade, no visible business, yet he possessed coin enough to purchase entire fishing fleets should he wish. His only constant was a stream of visitors who arrived at the estate under the cover of night. Women, mostly. Women brought by carriages that came from Boston, Portsmouth, and even farther. They arrived frightened, trembling, some of them bound, others simply too exhausted to resist. And more often than not, they never left. The few who did return came back altered, their minds fractured, their words incoherent. They spoke of rooms that shifted, corridors that led nowhere, and voices whispering from the walls themselves. They spoke of Jonathan Whitmore's study, where strange instruments gleamed beneath candlelight, and of the cries, inhuman, prolonged, echoing, from deep beneath the house. The townsfolk of Goldsboro told themselves it was not their concern. Better to avert their eyes and to meddle in the affairs of a man so wealthy, so commanding, so cold. But in every hushed conversation, in every fearful glance toward the Whitmore estate, one question lingered unanswered. What was Jonathan Whitmore doing beneath those granite floors? The truth would reveal itself in time, but when it did, it would damn not only the man, but every generation that carried his cursed name. The first real glimpse into the darkness of the Whitmore estate came not from the whispers of women who returned broken, nor from the fearful stories of travelers, but from a boy. Samuel Cottle was only 14 when his life intersected with the Whitmores. The son of a fisherman, he often roamed the forest near the estate, setting snares and traps to bring home rabbits when the sea was too unforgiving. One mist-soaked morning, in the waning days of autumn, Samuel ventured farther than he intended. The fog was thick, muffling sound, cloaking the trees in white silence. That was when he heard it, the faint chime of metal against stone, deliberate, rhythmic, as though someone were to hammer deep beneath the earth. Curiosity outweighed caution. Samuel crept closer until he stood within sight of the looming Whitmore mansion, its granite walls rising out of the mist like a tomb. From a narrow vent at the base of the foundation, the sounds grew louder, scraping, hammering, and something else, something far worse, a muffled cry that quivered with desperation before being silenced with chilling abruptness. Samuel pressed his ear to the cold iron grate, and what he heard would stalk his dreams forever. Voices, low, deliberate, controlled. Jonathan Whitmore's voice, unmistakable even to a boy. He spoke with authority, not in prayer nor in conversation, but in command. Words Samuel could not entirely understand, but phrases like "hold her steady" and "observe the response" seared themselves into his mind. And then, screaming. High, ragged, unnatural. The kind of scream that seemed to come from deeper than the lungs, as though the soul itself were being torn apart. Samuel ran. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing on the forest floor, gasping for breath. He told no one. Who would believe him? A poor fisherman's boy accusing one of the wealthiest men in Maine of horrors unspeakable? And yet, though his lips remained sealed, his terror became contagious. He avoided the estate, warning his younger siblings never to wander near it. Over time, other children whispered the same. The Whitmore land became a forbidden place, spoken of only in hushed tones. But Jonathan Whitmore was no fool. He knew the whispers in town. He saw the unease in the eyes of the villagers. And so, he did what all men of power do when suspicion grows too sharp. He cloaked his deeds in charity. In the spring of 1815, he announced the founding of the Whitmore Sanctuary, a supposed haven for troubled women. A place of healing, he called it, where the afflicted may find peace of mind and restoration of spirit. His words dripped with solemnity. His posture radiated piety. The townsfolk wanted to believe him. A sanctuary for troubled women sounded noble, godly even. And when Jonathan donated heavily to the local church and provided food to struggling families during a particularly harsh winter, skepticism softened into gratitude. Few dared to question him openly after that. But behind the walls, the truth only grew darker. The women brought to the estate were not healed, they were studied. Jonathan's interest was not in faith nor in medicine, as the villagers understood it. He was consumed by a singular obsession. The mind, to him, the human mind was a labyrinth, a cage of flesh concealing mysteries that science had only begun to glimpse. He believed suffering opened doors of knowledge to control, to power over the most intimate recesses of human will. And so he experimented. Some women were subjected to isolation, locked away in stone cells without light, their sanity measuring the time it took for their voices to break into incoherent babble. Others endured physical treatments, submersion in icy water, binding in iron restraints, and the piercing shock of instruments no villager could have named. And beneath it all, beneath the cruelty, there was always Jonathan Whitmore's meticulous hand, writing, recording, documenting every scream, every tremor, every fractured thought. The house itself became an accomplice. Its walls absorbed suffering. Its foundations shook with muffled wails. The chambers carved into the granite basement became a subterranean warren of cruelty. Surgical tables, restraint chairs, and journals filled with diagrams so grotesque they seemed almost unearthly. It was here the Whitmore legacy was born, not in wealth nor in status, but in the shadows of human torment. A legacy written not with ink, but with blood. And though the town of Goldsboro would turn its face away, pretending not to hear, the land itself did not forget. The forest grew strangely still around the estate, birds abandoning its trees, the earth souring beneath its stones. Even the sea, once generous to fishermen, seemed to grow hostile, its tides blackening the shore near Whitmore land. Nature knew what the townsfolk would not admit. Something unnatural had taken root in Maine, and its name was Whitmore. By the late 1810s, the Whitmore Sanctuary had become a paradox, a place spoken with reverence in public, yet whispered with dread in private. To the outside world, Jonathan Whitmore was a benefactor, a man sacrificing his fortune for the betterment of troubled women. Families from as far as Boston sent their daughters, wives, and sisters, believing they would be restored. Yet in the taverns of Goldsboro, where men drank away the ache of salt-water lungs and winter hunger, darker stories spread. Some claimed the women never left at all, that their carriages arrived but departed empty, their occupants swallowed by the Whitmore estate. Others told of fishermen who swore they heard cries drifting across the tide at night, carried on the wind like the voices of drowned souls. And still others, the boldest of them, spoke of lights, unnatural, blue-white, pulsing from the mansion's basement windows long after midnight. But fear is a strange thing. It breeds silence more often than rebellion. The people of Goldsboro had families to feed, fields to tend, seas to face. Who among them would risk everything to challenge a man like Jonathan Whitmore, whose wealth could crush them, whose influence reached into Boston itself? Better, always better, to look away. It was Eleanor Whitmore, pale and fading, who bore the truest weight of her husband's obsessions. Once she had been seen at church, a porcelain figure draped in fine silks, her voice so soft it seemed she might vanish if one spoke too loudly near her. By 1817, she no longer appeared at all. The mansion's iron gates closed her off from the world, and though the townsfolk still referred to her as Mistress Whitmore, she had become more phantom than flesh. Whispers said she had gone mad, that her husband's experiments had turned from strangers to his own wife. One maid, who fled the estate after only a week of service, spoke tremblingly of Eleanor's voice echoing down the halls at night, not speaking, but singing, low, wordless notes that rose and fell like waves against stone. The maid claimed the sound was not human at all, that it curdled the blood in her veins and drove her to run to the forest rather than hear it a second night. She swore she saw Eleanor once, wandering the upper hall, her eyes glassy, her hair unbound, her mouth twitching in a smile too wide, too fixed. No one hired the maid after that. She vanished in the town records, as though the earth itself swallowed her. Meanwhile, Jonathan's work only deepened. He wrote letters, hundreds of them, to physicians, philosophers, and anatomists in Europe. He begged for instruments, for chemicals, for books on the mind. Some answered, sending packages across the Atlantic. Others ignored him, unsettled by his fervor. But a select few, men already walking the same dark path, became correspondents. Among them was a German doctor named Heinrich Bauer, whose writings on the separation of reason from soul bordered on the heretical. In Bauer, Jonathan found not just a colleague but a mirror. Together, through letters carried by ship, they plotted the dissection of the human psyche. Bauer encouraged him to abandon restraint, to seek not merely to treat madness, but to create it, to shatter the human mind like glass, and then rebuild it in new shapes. Through suffering, Bauer wrote, the mind is made malleable. The will may be broken as a blacksmith breaks iron, then reforged in any form one desires. God has left man unfinished, and it is for men such as we to complete his work. Jonathan took these words to heart. The basement chambers of the Whitmore estate grew more elaborate. Walls were lined with iron restraints. Tables bore grooves where bodies had been strapped down, so often the wood itself had absorbed the shape of human flesh. Shelves filled with glass jars containing organs suspended in cloudy fluid, tongues, eyes, fragment of gray tissue cut with surgical precision. And always, there were the journals, their pages filled with diagrams of brains marked with incisions, notes in Jonathan's meticulous hand describing each subject's descent from reason into incoherence. Yet even as he documented their unraveling, Jonathan's hunger grew. Observation was no longer enough. He craved transformation. He wanted to see if the human will could be erased and replaced. Could a woman stripped of her memories, her faith, her name itself, be molded into something new, something obedient, something perfect? It was a question that would shape the Whitmore legacy forever. For once asked, it demanded an answer, and Jonathan Whitmore was a man who always found answers, no matter the cost. The first undeniable fracture in the Whitmore facade came in the summer of 1819, when a storm lashed the Maine coast with such fury that even the Whitmore estate could not remain sealed. The tempest came suddenly, black skies splitting with lightning, winds that tore shingles from roofs and snapped trees at their base. That night, Jonathan Whitmore's mansion seemed to groan with the weight of the storm, its granite walls rattling, its windows bowing inward against the force of nature. But it was not the wind or the rain that chilled the townsfolk to their marrow. It was what the storm revealed. For in the early hours of morning, when the storm abated and fishermen crept to the shore to assess the damage, something washed up on the beach. A body. It was a woman, young, pale, her skin waxen, her hair matted with blood. She was dressed in a thin linen gown, the kind issued to patients at the Whitmore sanctuary. Her wrists bore bruises, deep and raw, as though she had been bound for weeks. Worse still was her face. Not the bruises, not the lacerations, but her expression. Her mouth hung slightly open in a fixed smile, her eyes wide and glassy, as though she had died mid-laughter at some obscene joke only she had heard. The townsfolk who found her recoiled. Some crossed themselves. Others swore never to speak of it. The storm had taken lives before. Bodies in the surf were not unknown. But this felt wrong. Deliberate. When the body was quietly brought to the church for burial, Deacon Samuel Foster, a stern but honest man, insisted upon examining her. What he discovered only deepened the terror. The back of her skull bore a small, precise incision, stitched crudely shut. Beneath the stitches, something had been done to her brain. The deacon did not have words for it, but he knew it was not natural. He demanded Jonathan Whitmore explain. Jonathan's reply was calm, almost soothing. He claimed the woman had been a patient, gravely ill, consumed by madness. He had attempted a surgical procedure, experimental but merciful, in hopes of easing her torment. The storm, he explained with practiced sorrow, must have broken a window in her chamber, and in her delirium she fled into the night. The sea had claimed her, and her death, though tragic, was beyond his control. The explanation satisfied some, but not all. Deacon Foster pressed further, questioning the nature of these procedures. Jonathan's eyes grew cold, his voice sharper. He reminded the deacon of the food he had given the town, the funds for the church, the sanctuary that bore his family name. He warned, without ever raising his voice, that to oppose him would not only dishonor charity, but jeopardize the very survival of Goldsboro in these lean times. The deacon fell silent. Yet in private, he confided to his wife that what he had seen on the girl's skull was not mercy. It was mutilation. That night, Foster dreamed of the woman's face, that frozen smile. He dreamed of her eyes, black and bottomless, staring at him from ashore. And when he awoke, he swore he heard faint laughter carried on the wind outside his window. Meanwhile, the Whitmore estate remained undisturbed. Women continued to arrive. Jonathan continued his work. Eleanor, his wife, drifted further into shadow. Some nights, villagers claimed they could hear her voice, faint but clear, carried across the forest. Not screams, not words, but lullabies, ancient, sorrowful tunes sung in a voice so hauntingly sweet that men stopped in their tracks, unable to move until the last note faded into the night. Those who heard it said it was not the voice of a woman, but of something hollowed, emptied, reshaped into a vessel for sound that no longer belonged to flesh. And through it all, Jonathan Whitmore wrote in his journals. He wrote of the mind as if it were clay, to be broken and reshaped. He wrote of memory as a parasite that could be cut away. And he wrote of obedience, not as a virtue, but as the ultimate creation. The townsfolk had begun to whisper of curses, of God's wrath, of demons. But the truth was far worse than superstition. For what Jonathan Whitmore pursued was not witchcraft nor devilry, but science, cold, methodical, merciless science. And that made him more dangerous than any phantom of folklore. For phantoms fade. Jonathan Whitmore did not. By the winter of 1820, Jonathan Whitmore believed he had found his first success. She was no one of note. A servant girl from the Boston docks, delivered to him by a cousin who owed him money. Her name was, and though Jonathan rarely wrote it in his journals, he preferred the term Subject A. Names, after all, carried memory, and memory was precisely what he intended to strip away, and had been difficult at first. She screamed through the nights, tore at her restraints, spat curses in a voice hoarse with desperation. But weeks of isolation, weeks of whispered promises and punishments, dulled her rage. Jonathan studied her as one might study an animal. He noted the changes in her posture, the shifts in her gaze, the moments when despair cracked into silence. He recorded the exact day she ceased asking for her family, the exact night she stopped crying altogether. It was then that the real work began. Jonathan used knives, probes, and chemical vapors distilled in glass vessels that glowed faintly blue in lamplight. He shaved her head and made incisions so precise they seemed almost reverent. He did not seek to kill her. Death was failure. Instead, he sought to rearrange. He believed the mind could be unstitched and rewoven like fabric. He burned away fragments of memory, cut into the folds of thought, scraped at the very seat of her identity. And when she emerged from the table, trembling, pale, barely breathing, she was no longer an, he wrote, with almost feverish delight, that she had become pliable. She no longer screamed, no longer resisted. She responded to his commands with a blankness that thrilled him. If he told her to sit, she sat. If he told her to smile, her lips stretched into a grotesque facsimile of joy. When he asked her name, she tilted her head confused and gave none. Jonathan called her Eve. In his writings, he described her as a clean slate, evidence that the soul can be erased and that the flesh may yet be taught to obey without question. To him, Eve was not a victim, but a proof of concept. But to those few who glimpsed her, she was something else entirely. One of the maids, tasked with carrying trays to the basement, swore that Eve did not blink, that her eyes followed the maid wherever she went, unblinking, unending, as though she were not seeing the maid but seeing through her. The maid refused to return, and 2 weeks later, she too vanished from the town without explanation. Another claimed she heard Eve humming to herself, low and strange, as though echoing Eleanor Whitmore's midnight songs. Yet the melody was fractured, broken into wrong notes that twisted the ear. Jonathan was ecstatic. In letters to Heinrich Bauer, he declared that he had crossed the threshold, that man was no longer bound by God's flawed creation of the human mind. He urged Bauer to come to America to join him in building a new Eden. But Bauer never came. He was rumored to have been executed in Bavaria for crimes too unspeakable to be recorded in public courts. Jonathan received the news with fury, but also with a renewed sense of destiny. If Bauer had been silenced, then the burden fell to him alone to continue their work. And so Eve remained, a living monument to his obsession. Eleanor Whitmore had, until then, existed in a twilight realm of silence. She drifted to the halls like a ghost wearing flesh, her eyes hollow, her voice scarce. To the servants, she was a tragic figure, a once elegant woman consumed by grief after the stillbirth of her child. But to Jonathan, she was a tool too fragile to use, a vessel cracked beyond repair. That changed the night she heard Eve. It was near midnight when the servants recalled hearing a voice echo through the corridors of the mansion. Not Jonathan's deep timbre, not the mutterings of the storm outside, but higher, thinner sound. A voice that seemed to echo from beneath the floorboards. Anne's voice, or what was left of it. She whispered names, strange, broken syllables. Sometimes they sounded like fragments of prayers. Other times they were only sobs twisted into sound. Jonathan dismissed them as reflex, nonsense sputtered by a body stripped of reason. But Eleanor, she listened. The next morning, she descended into the basement. For the first time in months, she asked Jonathan a question. "Who is she?" Jonathan, startled, replied coldly, "She is mine." Eleanor said nothing more. But that night, when Jonathan slept in his study, she crept down again. The servants would later whisper what they saw. Eleanor sitting before Eve, her gown pulling around her like a shroud, her face close to the blank mass of the girls. She spoke softly, like a mother to a newborn, and Eve responded, at first, only with a flicker of her eyes, then with a faint, unnatural smile, and finally with words or echoes of them, broken, stuttering, incomplete phrases that dripped like blood from a wound. The servants swore they heard Eve murmur mother, though her tongue seemed clumsy, as if unused the weight of language. From that night onward, Eleanor returned again and again. Her lullabies, once mournful, now laced the halls with strange, tender madness. She would sing, and Eve would hum in return, a dissonant harmony that made even the bravest servant feel their skin crawl. Jonathan, at first, was furious. Eve was his creation, his proof. To see Eleanor tampering with her, feeding her words, coaxing out fragments of self, was infuriating. Yet as days passed, his fury gave way to fascination, for Eve was not meant to remember. And yet, beneath Eleanor's lullabies, she seemed to awaken, if only in shards. In his journals, Jonathan wrote, "The experiment defies its own boundaries. Subject, under external stimuli, Eleanor, manifest fragment of identity. I had not accounted for the contagion of madness, how one broken mind might stir another. What emerges is neither subject nor self, but hybrid. A hybrid, that was his word. Servants began reporting shadows, moving where no lamp burned. They heard whispers bleating from the walls. Once, a maid claimed she saw Eleanor and Eve standing hand in hand at the top of the staircase, their faces turned in perfect unison toward her, their eyes reflecting the same hollow gleam, as though one soul stretched between two bodies. Jonathan did not punish them for this. Instead, he observed. He noted that Eleanor no longer wept, no longer drifted aimlessly. She had purpose again. It was as though he had become her child, reborn, reshaped, a grotesque answer to grief. Yet this bond birthed something Jonathan did not predict. For in his pursuit of obedience, he had overlooked something far older, far more powerful than science. The bond between mother and child, even when forged in madness, was not easily broken. And as the winter of 1820 deepened, the mansion no longer belonged to Jonathan alone. It belonged to Eleanor and to Eve. Together, they began to sing to be why early spring of 1821. The town of Portsmouth had begun to whisper. It was subtle at first, a murmur among fishermen that strange sounds carried across the bay on misty nights. A farmer's wife, walking home at dusk, swore she heard singing, two voices, one low and broken, the other high and childlike, woven together in a hymn that chilled her blood. She insisted no one had been near. The song had come from the direction of the Whitmore estate. The Whitmores had always kept their distance from the town. Wealth shielded them, and Jonathan's reputation as a scholar of medicine, though murky, gave him an air of dignity. People knew of Eleanor's decline and pitied her, but no one pried too deeply. A family's grief was their own, and the Whitmores were not a family to cross. But now unease grew. Dogs howled at the Whitmore gates at night. Children claimed they saw a pale figure at the windows, staring down at them when they dared wander too close. Shopkeepers began to notice Eleanor's absence from church. She had once attended regularly, but now no one could recall the last time they had seen her in the pews. The priest himself remarked, half in jest, that he had prayed for her soul, for he feared she lingered too long among the shadows. Then came the night of the storm. A violent nor'easter tore across the coast, lashing the town with rain and waves that battered the docks. As lightning split the sky, several townsfolk swore they heard singing rising above the howl of the wind, not the raucous songs of sailors or the drunken cries of men at the tavern, but slow, deliberate hymn, carried on the air like a curse. Two voices, always two. The storm raged until morning, and when it passed, fishermen found several of their nets torn to ribbons, as though cut with deliberate hands. They muttered of ill omens, of dark spirits called from the sea by unnatural rites. Jonathan, meanwhile, wrote in his journal with a feverish hand. The voices carry. I hear them from beyond the confines of the chamber. The experiment evolves without my intervention. Eve and Eleanor are bound by forces unseen, whether chemical, spiritual, or divine corruption, I cannot yet discern. But the town reacts. Fear is a contagion, and contagion may serve my purposes. Jonathan did not fear discovery. He craved it. If the town began to whisper, then his work was working. Something was being birthed within the Whitmore estate. Something greater than Eve, greater than grief. The servants, however, knew terror more intimately. They dared not leave their rooms at night. They swore that Eleanor and Eve walked the halls together, barefoot, their steps soundless on the wooden floors. More than once, a maid claimed to hear scratching at her door, followed by the faintest giggle, a child's voice, though no child lived in the house. One footman, new to the estate, fled after only 3 nights. When asked in town why he left, he only muttered, They watch you when you sleep. Both of them. Their eyes don't close. He never returned. And still, the voices grew louder. Louder than storms, louder than reason. It was no longer just grief or madness. It was something that wanted to be heard. Something using Eleanor's lullabies as a vessel. Something older than Jonathan's science. Older than the Whitmore name. Something that had chosen the mansion as its mouthpiece. And the town, though they did not yet know it, was already listening. By midsummer, the murmurs in Portsmouth grew too heavy to ignore. Fear, once confined to taverns and supper tables, began to crawl into daylight. The Whitmore mansion, perched on its hill, no longer seemed like a house of mourning. It had become a beacon, drawing eyes, suspicions, and dread. The first act of defiance came from the church. Reverend Alden, an aging but resolute man, rose one Sunday and declared before his congregation, "There are voices in the night, and they are not of God. The Lord tests us with grief, but the devil tempts us with imitation. Beware the house on the hill." The parishioners murmured in agreement, some clutching rosaries, others crossing themselves. For weeks they had heard the same strange melodies, the same unnatural harmonies wafting from the mansion's direction. What could one say, except that something unholy stirred within its walls? That evening, a small group of townsmen, emboldened by the Reverend's words, decided to confront Jonathan Whitmore. They carried lanterns and torches, though none admitted aloud why they felt the need for fire. The path to the Whitmore estate was overgrown, weeds twisting up the iron gates like grasping hands. The men pushed through, their lights flickering against the mansion's stone facade. It loomed like a mausoleum, its windows black and still. They knocked at the great wooden door. No answer. They pounded again. Still silence. But just as one man muttered they should leave, the door creaked open of its own accord. Inside, the air was heavy with a scent none could place. Partly the musk of old wood, partly something sweeter, almost rotten, like lilies left too long in stagnant water. They called for Whitmore. Their voices echoed through the halls. Then they heard it, not footsteps, not the creak of floors, but humming. It came from the staircase above. There, standing in the half-dark, was Eleanor. Her gown was white, though stained with age and shadow. Her hair hung loose over her face, and in her hand she held another, smaller, paler. Eve stood beside her, barefoot, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she gazed down at the intruders. The men froze. "Mrs. Whitmore," one finally stammered, "we've come to inquire. There have been disturbances." Eleanor tilted her head in perfect unison with Eve. Then, as if rehearsed, both began to hum the same low, haunting note. Their voices blended, doubled, multiplied, filling the hall like a choir of the damned. One man dropped his lantern. It shattered on the floor, fire licking the wood. In panic, they stumbled back, retreating through the open door. By the time they reached the safety of the path, the mansion loomed silent once more, the door shut tight. When they told the tale in town, some scoffed. "Fear exaggerates," they said, yet all agreed on one thing. No one should go to the Whitmore estate again, not without God's protection. Jonathan, in his journal, was almost jubilant. The townsfolk have seen the union. They have fled in fear as expected. Their terror is proof of success. Eleanor and Eve, inseparable now, project more than song. They project presence. I have crafted not only a body, but an aura. But Jonathan misunderstood. What he saw as triumph was not entirely his creation. The thing that looked through Eleanor's hollow eyes and Eve's pale mask was not his invention alone. It was something else, wearing their grief as its veil. And for the first time, it had witnesses. Jonathan Whitmore was no fool. He had spent years studying medicine, anatomy, the hidden machinery of the human body. Yet, what stirred inside his home was something no scalpel, no vial, no textbook could define. And still, he believed it could be harnessed. In the weeks after the townsman's intrusion, Jonathan withdrew further into his work. He abandoned his patients in town, ignoring their fevers and broken bones. He no longer traveled, no longer answered letters. His world narrowed to the mansion's shadowed halls and the rooms where Eleanor and Eve dwelled. The journals grew frantic. They do not merely sing. They resonate. Their voices vibrate in the walls, in the marrow of my bones. It is not air that carries the sound. It is something older, a frequency beneath reason. I must find its source. If it can be reproduced, it could rewrite the very boundaries of science. Imagine a cure for death itself, communicated through sound. He began constructing strange devices. Tubes, copper wires, and glass vessels filled his study. At night, he placed them outside Eleanor's chamber, hoping to capture and measure the vibrations of her hymns. He scrawled diagrams of waveforms, though the ink bled into near-incoherent spirals. The servants watched in terror. They whispered among themselves that Jonathan had ceased being a doctor and had become something worse, a man dissecting the soul instead of the body. One maid swore she saw Eleanor and Eve sitting in the parlor, facing each other with eyes closed, humming in perfect harmony. She said the air around them shimmered, as if heat rose from the floorboards, though no fire burned. She fainted at the sight and was dismissed the next day when Jonathan caught her praying over the banister. But Jonathan pressed forward. He began experiments late into the night, often dragging cadavers from the town morgue under cover darkness. What he did with them, no one knew for certain. But scraps of his notes suggest he believed the resonance could be imparted to the dead, an echo of life transferred into cold flesh. If sound can summon memory, if grief can give voice to the lost, he wrote, then why should not a body, properly prepared, vibrate again with that same force? Resurrection not by miracle, but by science. Eleanor is the key. Eve is the instrument. Together, they are the conduit. Eleanor herself was slipping further from the woman she once had been. She no longer spoke in words, only in fragments of hymns, nursery songs, and guttural whispers. Sometimes her lips moved, but Eve's voice emerged. Sometimes Eve's mouth opened, and Eleanor's broken lullabies spilled out, their identities blurred, the boundary between them dissolving. And the townsfolk? They kept their distance, but they heard. Each night, their houses shuddered as the unseen chorus spread from the mansion. Babies woke screaming. Dogs clawed at doors, and fishermen swore the tides themselves shifted with the sound. Jonathan recorded it all. But the more he tried to study, the more the presence resisted. Late one night, while adjusting his devices, he felt the hum pass through him, not just through his ears, but through his chest, rattling his heart like a drum. His vision darkened, his body collapsed, and for a moment he believed he had died. When he awoke, Eleanor and Eve were standing over him, both smiling, both in perfect silence. For the first time, Jonathan was afraid, and in his fear he made a fatal decision. He would no longer simply observe the resonance. He would join it. Jonathan Whitmore had always seen himself as a man of reason, a scholar, a physician, a master of the body's hidden gears. But reason had become a cage, and grief the key that shattered it. The night he collapsed beneath the resonance was the night he realized he had been standing outside the true mystery. Eleanor and Eve were not just subjects. They were doorways, and doorways were meant to be crossed. His journals from this period read, less like scientific notes, and more like scripture written by a prophet in fever. The sound is not theirs alone. It is a current, a river. It flows through them, through me, through every atom that trembles in its wake. Why should I remain apart from it when it calls for union? To study from afar is cowardice. To enter is to transcend. He began his preparations. First came fasting. For 3 days, he refused food, insisting that his body be purified. The servants, those who had not already fled, whispered that his cheeks grew gaunt, his skin waxy and pale. Then came the cutting. Small incisions along his forearms, the chest, even across his ribs. Not deep enough to kill, but deliberate. He spoke of wanting his flesh to become a vessel receptive to vibration. He stuffed the wounds with herbs, ashes, and oils until they festered, claiming the pain opened him closer to the frequency. Finally came the night of the experiment. Jonathan cleared the grand hall of its furniture, laying copper wires in intricate spirals across the floor. At the center, he placed a wooden chair draped with Eleanor's wedding veil. His journals say he believed the veil, stained with years of grief, carried the essence of resonance. He sat upon it, stripped to his bloodied scars. Eleanor and Eve were brought forward, silent and pale. He positioned them across from each other, instructing them to hold hands and hum. At first, their voices were soft, delicate, almost human. But as the minutes passed, the sound thickened, vibrating the air, rattling the windows, groaning through floorboards. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the copper wires hummed as though alive. Jonathan threw his head back, arms wide, whispering, "Yes, yes, let it pass through me." The servants who remained dared not watch, but they heard. They claimed the sound grew so intense that their bones ached, their teeth chattered, their vision blurred. One swore that shadows bled from the walls, pooling like liquid around the chair. And then Jonathan began to sing, not in his own voice, but in a tone that was both his and not his, like two men speaking through one throat. His eyes rolled white. Blood streamed from his ears and nose. His body convulsed, yet his mouth moved with unnatural precision. The resonance had entered him. When the sound ceased, Jonathan collapsed to the floor. The servants rushed to his side, but he waved them away with trembling hands. His lips curved into a smile, cracked and bloody. "I heard her," he whispered. "I heard Eve. She spoke to me." But Eleanor and the pale figure beside her only stared in silence. From that night onward, Jonathan was not the same. His gait changed, his speech faltered, his laughter came at strange and hollow times. He no longer slept. He no longer ate. He existed in a state between ecstasy and decay. The doctor who once sought to study death now carried death's hum inside him, and the mansion itself seemed to awaken with him. Doors shut on their own. Lamps flickered. At times, the whole house groaned as though breathing. Jonathan had become part of the resonance, but in doing so, he had unleashed it beyond his own control. IT began subtly. The townsfolk first noticed in the wind. At night, when the breeze shifted down from the cliffs, it carried with it a low, trembling hum, like the bow of a violin drawn across strings too thick for mortal instruments. Mothers closed shutters, claiming it unsettled their children. Fishermen muttered that the tides had grown restless, waves colliding with the shore at strange intervals, as if some hidden drum beat beneath the sea. Then came the voices. They seeped into dreams. Men woke in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, certain they had heard their wives whispering their names, only to turn and see their wives fast asleep. Children cried out, insisting that someone else had been singing their lullabies from the corner of the room. One family fled their home entirely after the father, half awake, saw his dead mother standing in the doorway, her lips moving in perfect silence. The town physician dismissed it all as exhaustion, nerves, or fever. But the townsfolk whispered the truth. The Whitmores had poisoned the air. Every night, the mansion grew louder. Farmers at the far edge of the valley swore. They could hear the sound rattling their barn doors, echoing off the hills. And those who ventured too near the estate after sundown, whether out of curiosity or foolish courage, returned pale, trembling, and unable to describe what they had heard. Some returned half-mad, muttering fragments of hymns, until their tongues split and bled. Jonathan, meanwhile, recorded it all. His journals from this time are a labyrinth of madness, half scientific sketches, half frenzied scrawls. The resonance expands. It no longer requires my instruments. It flows freely, seeping through stone, through air, through the fragile minds of the weak. The town resists, but resistance is futile. Soon, they too will be vessels. The servants began to abandon the mansion, slipping away in the night. Those who remained were either too frightened to leave, or too entangled in Jonathan's experiments to imagine freedom. And as their numbers dwindled, the house itself grew emptier, darker, filled only with the ceaseless vibration that seemed to emanate from Eleanor and Eve. But the true horror came when the resonance began to follow. One widow in town, whose husband had died at sea, claimed she heard his voice calling her from the cliffs. Drawn to it, she walked for hours in the darkness until she was found at dawn, standing barefoot on the rocks, eyes rolled white, murmuring the name of her drowned husband. Another man hanged himself in his barn after insisting that the voices of his dead children would not let him rest. When the neighbors cut him down, his body was still warm, his lips curved in a faint smile as though he had died in peace. By now, the town had reached its breaking point. Churches filled with trembling congregants, priests fumbling through prayers that seemed powerless against the unseen force. Some demanded the mansion be burned. Others whispered that to set fire to it would only release the resonance into the open air, where it would never be contained again. And in the mansion, Jonathan watched from the window, his eyes hollow, his smile feverish. "They resist," he wrote, "but soon they will learn what I have learned. The resonance is not death. It is not life. It is the bridge, the sound between the worlds." But he was wrong about one thing. The resonance was no bridge. It was a flood, and the valley was beginning to drown. By the winter of 1875, the town had reached its breaking point. Livestock were being born still, their bodies trembling as though something had passed through them before breath could take hold. Infants screamed in their cradles at night, not with hunger, but with a shrill, keening sound that mimicked the resonance itself. Sleep had become a luxury, sanity a dwindling resource. And so the townsfolk gathered in the church square, farmers, fishermen, widows, and weary mothers clutching their sleepless children. They spoke of their dead who walked in dreams, of voices that called from the cliffs, of shadows that swayed in rhythm with sounds that should not exist. The priest, pale and trembling, could offer no scripture strong enough to quiet them. His voice broke when he finally whispered what they all already knew. The Whitmores have brought this upon us. The decision was not voted on. It did not need to be. By torchlight and trembling hands, they armed themselves, shotguns, pitchforks, butchers' knives, even rusted farm tools. It was not the weaponry of soldiers, but people too desperate to wait for salvation. The march to the mansion was silent. The only sound was the crunch of frost beneath their boots and the far-off moan of the sea. Even the wind seemed to hush, as though holding its breath for what was to come. But as they neared the estate, the sound returned. It came not in a sudden burst, but as a slow and suffocating pressure, like air thickening around their throats. The torches flickered in unison. Some swore their hearts began to beat in rhythm with the hum. By the time the mansion rose before them, its windows black and gaping, the crowd was already faltering. Mothers clutched their ears. Children cried out. Men dropped their tools and pressed hands to their temples as though skulls might split. Still, they pressed forward, because what waited behind them, the endless nights, the whispers, the slow unraveling of their sanity, was worse. They reached the gates. Rusted iron, streaked with frost, rattled in the sound as though vibrating along with the unseen frequency. And then silence, so sudden, so absolute, it was more terrifying than the noise itself. The crowd froze. Every breath seemed deafening in that vast and hollow pause. The torches hissed in the winter air. Somewhere, far above, an owl shrieked and fled. It was then that the front door of the mansion opened. Jonathan Whitmore stepped into view, but he was no longer a man. His once proud frame was hunched and trembling, his skin blotched with sores that pulsed faintly with each heartbeat. His eyes glowed wetly in the torchlight, pupils wide and unblinking. Blood streaked from his ears, yet he did not wipe it away. He smiled as though greeting old friends. "Children of the valley," he rasped, his voice raw and layered with something beneath it, as though a second throat whispered the words in harmony. "You need not fear. The sound is not your enemy. It is your inheritance." The crowd recoiled. A woman shouted that he was a devil. A man raised his rifle, hand shaking. But before he could fire, a sound issued from behind Jonathan, soft, fragile, and unbearably sweet. Two figures emerged from the shadows of the doorway. Eleanor, pale as ivory, her eyes hollow but unyielding. And beside her, Eve, her double, her echo, her impossible reflection. Their mouths opened together, and the sound began again, not the faint hum, but a force. It rolled through the valley like thunder buried in the earth, rattling bones, bending knees, cracking the iron gates with invisible pressure. The crowd screamed, but the sound drowned them. Torches fell, sparks scattering. Some clutched their chests, gasping for air. Others dropped where they stood, their minds broken in an instant. Jonathan spread his arms wide. "Behold," he cried, "the resonance does not destroy, it remakes. But to the townsfolk, it was no miracle. It was annihilation. The sound struck first like a gale, then like a flood, pouring over the crowd with suffocating weight. Torches burst, sputtering into smoke, plunging the scene into half-darkness, where only the pallid glow of the mansion's windows lit their faces. Men dropped to their knees, vomiting from the pressure in their skulls. Mothers shielded their children, though the children seemed already entranced. Eyes glassy, lips murmuring the sound as though they too had been seized by its rhythm. But desperation can drive even the broken to revolt. The first rifle cracked through the noise. A farmer, face streaked with blood from his nose, fired blindly at the figures in the doorway. The shot splintered with near Jonathan's shoulder. For a heartbeat, silence followed. The crowd took it as a sign. They surged. The gates buckled under their weight. Iron shrieked as it snapped. And the mob, ragged, terrified, furious, spilled onto the Whitmore grounds. They advanced with shotguns, axes, rusted sabers that had not seen battle in decades. They screamed not words but primal cries, a counterpoint to the resonance itself. Jonathan did not flinch. He raised his hands as though conducting an unseen orchestra. At once, Eleanor and Eve sang louder. The sound sharpened into a piercing frequency that shattered glass panes across the front of the mansion. Shards rained down, glittering like falling stars. The crowd staggered, clutching ears, but still they pressed on. The first to reach the steps was a butcher with arms thick from years at the block. He swung his cleaver at Jonathan's chest. But before steel could meet flesh, his body convulsed mid-strike. His eyes rolled back, his limbs stiffened, and he collapsed, trembling violently as foam frothed at his lips. The cleaver clattered harmlessly at Jonathan's feet. Another man rushed forward, screaming a prayer. He didn't make it 2 steps before his skull seemed to cave inward, blood streaming from his ears in crimson rivulets. He fell forward, dead before he touched the ground. Panic rippled through the mob, but fear had already lost its power. Madness drove them now. They stormed the steps, weapons flashing in the dim light, voices hoarse with rage. The resonance grew, layering upon itself, a storm of notes no human throat should form. The mansion's very foundations shook. Stone cracked. The iron hinges of the door screeched. And then, the impossible happened. One of the townsfolk, a young woman no older than 20, managed to reach Eleanor. She swung a hammer with desperate strength, striking the girl's shoulder. The blow landed, bone splintering with a sickening crack. Eleanor stumbled, her voice breaking. For a fraction of a second, the sound faltered. The mob roared with hope, but the silence was worse. Eve screamed. It was not a human scream, but the howl of something ancient and vengeful. Windows for miles shattered in unison. The woman who had struck Eleanor burst open from the inside. Blood spraying, ribs cracking outward like a grotesque cage torn apart. Her hammer flew uselessly from her twitching hand. The resonance surged back, doubled, tripled, crushing the mob under its weight. Dozens fell in convulsions. Some fled, stumbling blindly into the night. But a few, just a few, pressed forward still, dragging their broken bodies toward the doorway as though determined to end the curse even if it cost their lives. Jonathan looked down at them with something between pity and pride. Futile, he whispered, though the sound carried across the chaos, as though spoken directly into every ear. You cannot kill what is not bound by flesh. Behind him, Eleanor cradled her shattered shoulder. Eve clung to her, their voices rising together again, weaving into a cord that seemed to stretch into eternity. And with that note, the house itself seemed to awaken. The walls groaned, the roof trembled, and shadows deepened into forms that writhed and reached, as though the Whitmore mansion had become more than stone and timber, had become a living instrument of the resonance itself. The mob had come to burn a house, but what they faced was no house at all. The Whitmore mansion had always loomed over the valley, like a relic too stubborn to decay. But on that night, as the resonance swelled and Eleanor and Eve screamed in perfect harmony, the house revealed its true nature. The timbers moaned, not with the weight of age, but with breath. Floorboards buckled upward as though ribs expanding. Shutters flung open of their own accord, slamming against the walls with thunderous rhythm. The air inside glowed faintly, as if veins of light now ran through its foundation, pulsing in time with the sound. The crowd had come to destroy a building. What they faced was a body, and it moved. The front steps quaked, cracks racing across stone like spiderwebs. The great iron door, its hinges already screaming, swung wide, but not outward, not as a door should. It stretched, warped, as though the wood itself had become pliable flesh. Figures pressed against it from within, shadows of things not human, their forms blurred and elongated, mouths stretched into silent howls. A dozen townsfolk, too close to retreat, were caught in the movement. The warped door yawned wide like a mouth, and the shadows reached. Their arms, if they were arms, wrapped around flesh and bone, pulling the screaming villagers into the dark. They vanished, their cries muffled instantly as if swallowed whole. The mob recoiled, horror eclipsing rage. But retreat was no escape. The resonance shook the very earth beneath their feet. The soil quivered. The roots of dead trees tore upward, writhing like serpents. Several attackers were seized by these roots, dragged screaming into frozen ground, their fingernails leaving bloody streaks as they clawed the earth. Inside, Jonathan's voice rose above the cacophony. "Do you see?" he roared, arms outstretched like a prophet on his altar. "The house is no prison. It is an instrument, and we are its players." He turned, his face luminous in the glow that pulsed from the walls. Blood streamed steadily from his eyes and ears, yet he did not falter. Instead, he began to sing. The sound that left his throat was not human. It was a guttural resonance that blended with the twins' voices, forming a triad of frequencies that clawed at the sanity of all who heard. Those closest to the mansion dropped their weapons and tore at their own flesh, raking nails across skin until strips hung loose. Others began to laugh hysterically, their minds splintered beyond repair. And still, a few pressed forward. One man, face half bloody from ruptured vessels, clutched a torch he had shielded from the sound. His voice cracked as he shouted above the din. "Burn it! Burn the devil's house!" He hurled the torch through a shattered window. For a moment, the fire caught. Curtains ignited, flames licking upward. Yet instead of consuming, the fire bent and swayed, drawn into the pulsing veins of the house itself. The blaze did not spread. It joined. The walls glowed brighter. The resonance deepened, and the mansion seemed to breathe smoke as though the fire had only given it strength. The crowd broke. Some fled into the woods, stumbling over roots that reached to ensnare them. Others collapsed on the lawn, twitching, their minds fractured. And still Jonathan sang, his voice a weapon sharper than steel. Eleanor and Eve, standing side by side despite the ruin of Eleanor's shoulder, harmonized with him, their faces pale masks of rapture. The resonance peaked. The house shuddered, and with a sickening groan, the very ground split open before the steps, a jagged wound in the earth. Heat rose from below, carrying with it a stench of rot and sulfur. Something moved in the dark fissure, something vast, unseen, yet heavy enough to rattle the bones of every survivor. The mob had not come to fight a family. They had awakened something older, something the Whitmores had only served. The fissure yawned wider, ripping the lawn into jagged halves. Soil and stone tumbled into the void, vanishing before any sound of impact could return. The heat that rose from below was unbearable, baking the flesh of those who lingered too close. Yet the true horror was not the heat. It was the movement. Something vast stirred in the abyss. The mob froze, terror locking their limbs. For all their fury, for all their resolve to burn the Whitmores in their house, none had come prepared to face what slithered beneath. The earth itself seemed to breathe, each exhale rattling through their bones, each inhale pulling at their lungs as though the very air was being swallowed. From the darkness came sound, low, resonant, deeper than anything the twins or Jonathan had sung. It was not music. It was a growl that stretched beyond hearing, vibrating in marrow, twisting thought itself. Men clutched their skulls, weeping, while others fell to their knees and pressed their foreheads to the ground in unconscious reverence. And then came the hand, not a hand of flesh, but of shadow, black and translucent, fingers stretching longer than a man's body, claws like shards of obsidian. It rose from the fissure slowly, deliberately, curling around the edges of the earth as if to pull itself free. Where the shadow touched, grass withered instantly. The trees nearest the house shuddered, their trunks splitting, their branches sagging under invisible weight before collapsing to dust. Screams erupted. The mob scattered. Some hurled themselves back over the broken gates, desperate to escape into forest. Others fired wildly into the dark, bullets tearing through air, but striking nothing. The hand of shadow reached higher, blotting out the pale light of the moon, and from the fissure came a sound like many voices whispering at once, 1,000 mouths speaking in harmony, too fast to understand, yet perfectly synchronized. The resonance of the Whitmores was nothing but an echo of this. Jonathan fell to his knees, his face awash in ecstasy. He lifted his arms toward the shadow, as a priest toward his god. Blood streamed freely from his nose, his eyes, his mouth, but he did not falter. Instead, he shouted over the roar of the abyss, "Behold, the voice of first sound, the womb of all resonance, the source we are but heirs to." Eleanor swayed beside him, lips pale, her shoulders still mangled. Eve clutched her hand, their voices weaving into a trembling harmony, feeding the shadow with their song. The house shook violently, its walls bulging, its windows shattering outward as if the structure could no longer contain the force surging through it. The mob's courage broke entirely. Those who remained on the lawn fled in all directions, abandoning weapons, abandoning kin. Mothers pulled children to the mud, their sobs drowned beneath the growl. Men stumbled into the forest, their torches extinguished by unseen winds. But escape brought no safety. Already the ground was cracking beyond the mansion. Long fissures splitting the valley as if the land itself rejected their presence. One boy, no older than 15, tripped near the steps. His father turned back for him, reaching, but the shadow hand was quicker. Fingers of darkness curled around the boy and pulled him into the fissure. His scream cut off in an instant. The father lunged after him, and vanished as well, devoured in silence. The mob had become prey, and still Jonathan sang. His voice rose to a fever pitch, splitting, multiplying, until it seemed a choir of Jonathans encircled the house. He no longer looked human. Veins bulged black beneath his skin, his jaw unhinged unnaturally wide. The resonance pouring from him merged with the growl below, creating a frequency that rattled the sky itself. Clouds split, lightning flared, but no rain came. Only fire that arced downward, striking the forest and igniting the night. The Whitmores had not unleashed a thing beneath the house. They had served it all along. And now, for the first time, it was listening. The valley had always been silent at night, save for the crickets and the distant murmur of the river. But now, silence was obliterated. The resonance spread outward like ripples in water, carried on the air, carried to the soil, carried in the very marrow of those who remained alive. The mob thought escape would save them. It would not, as they staggered into the tree-lean, fleeing the monstrous hand clawing its way free from the fissure. The sound followed them. The deeper they ran, the more the forest betrayed them. Trees groaned, bending as though to listen. Branches cracked not from wind but from pressure, snapping like bones beneath unseen weight. Animals shrieked in terror. Birds hurled themselves against trunks, breaking wings. Foxes and deer writhed on the ground as their spines arched unnaturally. The resonance was everywhere. One man clutched his ears, blood trickling between his fingers. He stumbled to his knees and screamed for silence, though none could hear him over the roar. Another woman tore at her throat with her nails until she collapsed, her voice gone forever. Children sobbed as their eyes rolled white, as though the frequency itself had entered their skulls and was playing them like instruments. And still the sound grew louder. Back at the mansion, Jonathan remained on his knees before the fissure. His body was broken, bleeding, but his voice was unyielding. Eleanor and Eve stood hand in hand, their harmony unwavering despite their exhaustion. The resonance built and built, and from the abyss the shadow hand reached higher, followed now by something else. Something vast and formless, a silhouette that dwarfed the mansion. Its body had no shape, and yet every shape a roiling storm of limbs and mouths, wings and claws, all shifting too quickly to see. The mind could not comprehend it. It could only recoil. The survivors in the forest felt its presence. Even beyond sight, they felt it. The ground split beneath their feet, roots bursting upward like tendrils to drag them down. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, curling toward them even when no firelight remained. A man raised his rifle and fired at nothing, only for the bullet to return, ricocheting through his skull as though the air itself rejected violence. The valley was no longer theirs. It belonged to the thing that had always slept beneath it. At the river's edge, a group of survivors huddled together, faces pale, breaths ragged. They spoke not in words, but in prayers, muttered fragments of scripture they could no longer recall fully. One woman clutched her rosary so tightly the beads cut into her palms, blood dripping into the water. Another stared blankly at the sky, her lips forming a hymn that twisted into laughter. Then the water began to rise. The river bubbled, boiling despite the night's chill. Steam rolled upward, carrying with it the same resonance, now distorted, as though the water itself were an instrument. Fish floated belly up, their scales peeling. A survivor leaned too close to the bank, and in an instant, a hand, not of water, not a shadow, but of both, snatched him into the current. His scream echoed once, then vanished, absorbed by the river as though it had swallowed his soul. Those who remained fled once more, but there was no refuge. Behind them, the mansion glowed like a beacon, veins of fire running through its walls, the shadow creature towering above it. Ahead of them, the valley split further, chasms tearing the earth into broken islands. And above them, the stars themselves seemed to pulse, flickering in rhythm with the sound. The Whitmores had not simply awakened something beneath their house. They had unshackled a resonance that would not stop with a single valley. And every survivor who fled carried it with them, in their blood, in their bones, in the trembling of their voices. The curse had become contagious. Thomas Hale was one of the few who had managed to survive the chaos on the Whitmore lawn. A carpenter by trade, he had been drawn into the mob less by hatred than by fear. Fear of what the Whitmores had done, of what they might yet unleash. But as he stumbled to the torn earth and burning forest, it became clear. His fear had been far too small. He had escaped the mansion, but he had not escaped the sound. It was inside him. At first it was subtle, a faint ringing in his ears, as though the world had gone quiet after a cannon's blast. But soon the ringing became rhythm, a pulse that matched the beat of his heart. Each step he took in the dark forest was mirrored by a low hum that did not come from his throat, yet filled his skull all the same. The others who ran with him noticed. Thomas, one whispered, "Stop humming." He froze, realizing his lips had not moved. And yet the sound persisted. It was not humming, it was resonance, vibrating through his bones, carried in his marrow. When he spoke to protest, his words fractured, splintering into echoes that overlapped, as if two, then three, then four voices spoke through him at once. The others recoiled. "Stay back," a man growled, raising his torch. "He's one of them now." Thomas reached out, pleading, but his hand trembled unnaturally, each finger twitching in time with the hum. His reflection in the torchlight showed veins blackening along his neck, climbing toward his eyes. He tried to scream that he was still human, but the sound that came out was not his own. It was a chord, deep and terrible, that sent birds erupting from the trees. The mob turned on him. They no longer carried unity, no longer carried purpose, only desperation. Knives were drawn, a stone lifted, a torch swung toward his chest. Thomas stumbled backward, horrified, but before the blow could fall, the forest itself intervened. The trees bent toward him. Branches curled like fingers, weaving between his body and the mob. Roots tore from the soil, slithering like serpents, forming a barrier that pulsed in time with his hum. The men froze, torches flickering as if Very would recoil from their flames. Thomas stared breathless as the realization struck him. The resonance was not killing him. It was claiming him. One of the women shrieked. She turned to flee, but the roots caught her ankles, dragging her to the ground. Her scream pitched high before cutting abruptly into silence as the soil swallowed her whole. The rest of the mob scattered, abandoning Thomas, abandoning one another. The forest closed in behind them, leaving him alone with the silence of the dead and the hum in his chest. But Thomas was not afraid. Not anymore. The hum that had begun his pain now filled him with a strange clarity. His vision sharpened. The dark forest glowed faintly, as though every tree pulsed with hidden veins of fire. He could feel the vibrations of insects beneath the soil, the trembling of leaves before they fell. He could even sense the others who had fled, their footsteps echoing distantly, their heartbeats pounding like drums in the farthest corners of his mind. For the first time in his life, he was not powerless. And for the first time, he understood why the Whitmores had never sought to escape their curse. Because the curse was not a burden. It was a gift. Thomas turned back toward the mansion, toward the towering shadow rising from Fisher. He dropped his tools, dropped his torch, dropped his faith in the God that had never answered him. His voice joined the resonance, pure and unwavering, as he began to walk. No march, back into the burning heart of the valley. He would not flee the shadow. He would serve it. The mansion loomed like a dying beast as Thomas approached, its walls cracked, its roof aflame, yet still standing defiantly against the night. The shadow that towered from the fissure had grown taller now, vast enough to blot out half the stars. Its form shifted constantly. One moment wings, the next a maw, the next something too fractured to describe. And always that low resonance rattling the world, beating in time with Thomas's blood. He did not approach with fear. He approached as one approaches an altar. The mob's fury had burned itself out. The survivors were scattered in the woods, hunted by shadows or swallowed by the land itself. But here, at the mansion's heart, Thomas felt no terror. The roots that tore the earth did not hinder him. The shadows that had shredded men in seconds parted for him, curling gently as if to guide his steps. When he entered the lawn, he saw them waiting. Jonathan knelt before the fissure, face pale, body trembling, yet still singing. His voice was cracked and raw, his lips torn and bleeding, but he would not stop. Beside him, Eleanor and Eve clasped one another's hands, their voices weaving into Jonathan's higher, clearer, eerily pure. Their eyes glowed faintly now, their pupils gone, their bodies swaying as though the resonance itself moved them like puppets. And then Jonathan turned. He should not have been able to hear Thomas's footsteps above the cacophony of sound, and yet he did. Slowly, painfully, Jonathan lifted his head, and for a moment their eyes met. Jonathan's lips curled into a smile. "You heard it, too," he rasped. His voice was more growl than words, but Thomas understood. Thomas fell to his knees before him. He tried to speak, but his own words fractured into chords, breaking into layers of voices that were not his own. His chest vibrated with the effort. His lungs burned as though they were filled with smoke, but his heart soared. For the first time, he did not feel small, did not feel powerless. He felt infinite. Eleanor released her sister's hand. She approached Thomas slowly, her bare feet gliding across the scorched earth. She was no longer simply a girl. The resonance had transfigured her, wrapped her in something ancient, something beyond flesh. When she reached him, she placed her hand on his cheek. Her skin was cold, her touch feather-light, but the hum inside Thomas leapt to meet her. "You are chosen," she whispered. But the whisper carried like a storm wind, echoing far beyond the lawn. Eve joined her sister, touching Thomas's other cheek. "Not by us," she said, her voice harmonizing perfectly with Eleanor's. "By—" Jonathan's body quaked as he forced himself upright, his knees buckling, his arms trembling. He stood before Thomas as though before a newly ordained priest. "You are family now," Jonathan declared. The resonance inside him made the word family stretch unnaturally, each syllable shattering into a dozen tones. "The blood has taken root in you. You are Whitmore, whether you will it or not." Thomas bowed his head, tears streaking his soot-stained face. "Then I will serve," he croaked, though his voice came out in a symphony of echoes. The fissure widened. The hand of shadow that clawed its way free reached higher, pulling with it more of the formless giant. Its voice, or perhaps simply the resonance magnified beyond comprehension, shook the air, toppling stones, splitting trees, boiling water in the distance. And yet within that chaos, Thomas felt calm. He was no longer alone. He was part of the choir. Jonathan extended a trembling hand. Thomas took it. Their veins blackened in unison. Their flesh cracked as the resonance carved itself into their very being. Eleanor and Eve began to sing louder, their harmony ascending to something near divine, something almost unbearable. The mob had sought to destroy the Whitmore family. Instead, they had helped it grow. Now it was no longer just bloodline, it was doctrine, and Thomas Hale was its first convert. The earth split wider, groaning like a wound torn open by unseen hands. From the fissure, the shadow rose higher, its shape coalescing into something terrible yet incomplete, as though the world itself strained to hold it. Its limbs were smoke and bone, flickering like lightning trapped inside black mist. Its torso stretched into the heavens, ribs yawning open like gates. No eyes marked its face, and yet every survivor who saw it later swore they felt its gaze burning into their marrow. The resonance deepened, vibrating through soil and air, through flesh and blood. The mansion's windows shattered in unison, spears of glass raining across the lawn. The air stank of copper and ozone, as though lightning had struck the ground and refused to leave. Jonathan collapsed to one knee, his body trembling, blood streaming from his ears. He tried to hold his song steady, but his voice cracked with the weight of the sound. Eleanor and Eve's harmony filled the void, piercingly beautiful, their words no longer language but pure tone. And Thomas, newly chosen, still unsteady, rose to his feet. The shadow's voice filled his head. It did not speak with words. It spoke with hunger. Sacrifice! The command burrowed through Thomas's thoughts like a hook. His body moved before his mind could resist. He turned toward the forest, where a handful of survivors still cowered at the tree line. They had lingered, drawn by horror, unable to flee even as the earth itself betrayed them. Men with bloodied shirts, women dragging injured children. Their torches burned low but still sputtered defiantly against the night. The shadow reached for them. Roots tore from the earth, twisting into tendrils, coiling like vipers. The survivors screamed, trying to flee, but the forest closed in. Branches bent low to block their path, soil sucking at their heels like quicksand. One man hurled his torch in desperation, but it fell harmlessly into the dirt, extinguished without flame. Thomas walked forward, his hum growing louder with each step. His eyes glowed faintly now, veins crawling black beneath the skin. He raised his hand, and the tendrils of root obeyed, snaring a young man by the waist and dragging him screaming across the ground. Jonathan tried to speak. His lips formed words, but only blood spilled forth. His body was failing, yet his eyes, wild-fevered, watched with terrible pride. Eleanor and Eve swayed together, their song rising, guiding the rhythm. Their voices sharpened as the man was dragged before the fissure. He clawed at the ground, toward his own flesh, begged for mercy, but the resonance drowned his cries. Thomas seized him by the throat. For a fleeting second, the carpenter's human heart beat in rebellion. He saw the man's terror, the same terror he himself had felt not long ago. His grip faltered, his breath caught. But then the shadow's voice surged within him, drowning the doubt, filling him with ecstasy. Sacrifice! Thomas pressed the man forward. The shadow reached down, not with fingers of flesh, but with tendrils of smoke and bone. They pierced the man's chest as if it were paper. He screamed once, high and shrill, before the resonance tore the sound from his lungs. His body convulsed, lifted from the ground, suspended like a puppet. His skin blackened, cracked, and split as though cooked from within. The shadow inhaled. The man collapsed into ash. The fissure widened further, the air rippling with force. The shadow's form grew taller, stronger, its ribcage knitting together, its limbs thickening with stolen life. The ground trembled beneath its weight, though it had no true weight, no substance that could be measured by human sense. Thomas staggered back, panting, his chest heaving, his hands slick with blood not his own. He should have felt horror. He should have felt grief. But all he felt was belonging. The Whitmore sang louder. Jonathan forced his broken body upright. Eleanor and Eve harmonizing beside him, and together their voices became a summons. The shadow was not finished. It wanted more, and it would not stop until every soul in the valley had been claimed. The forest edge burned with the last courage of the living. The remaining survivors, what few still clung to their torches, pitchforks, and rifles, gathered in desperation. Their faces were pale and streaked with soot, but defiance flickered in their eyes. The Fisher's monster silhouette towered behind the Whitmores, yet some primal instinct refused to yield. Humanity, however fragile, demanded a stand. Now a voice cried. Gunfire cracked. Rifles spitting flame into the night. Bullets tore through the air, some striking Jonathan, some grazing Thomas, others vanishing into the shadow itself. Jonathan staggered but did not fall. The resonance seemed to knit his wounds shut even as blood spilled freely. Thomas hardly flinched. The bullets struck his flesh, but his body accepted them, as though the shadow drank the metal from his veins. The mob's torches flew next, arcs of fire cutting through the darkness. The mansion's scorched walls caught again, flames roaring higher, but the inferno could not smother the resonance. If anything, the fire seemed to feed it, casting the shadow into sharper relief. Eleanor and Eve did not falter. Their song climbed above the gunfire, above the screams, filling the valley like a cathedral bell tolling the death of hope. Their voices harmonized with the monster itself, as though the shadow's hunger and the twins' melody were two halves of the same hymn. The roots answered. They erupted from the soil in violent coils, tearing to the forest floor, uprooting trees, splintering trunks like matchsticks. Survivors screamed as the roots wrapped around their legs, yanking them off their feet. Some hacked desperately with axes, but for each root severed, 3 more rose. A woman clutched her child, running toward the river. She nearly reached the bank before the ground split beneath her. Her body vanished in an instant, swallowed whole by the earth as if she had never existed. Only her child's shriek lingered, cut short when tendrils coiled around his tiny frame and dragged him into the fissure. Panic broke the survivors' resolve. They scattered, fleeing deeper into the trees, yet the forest betrayed them. Branches bent low to strike their faces, roots tangled their feet, shadows lengthened to swallow them. Their torches sputtered uselessly against the encroaching dark. Still, one man remained. He was broad-shouldered, his face smeared with ash, his hands trembling as he raised his rifle. Unlike the others, he did not flee. His eyes locked on Thomas, and in his gaze burned not just fear, but fury. "You're one of us," he shouted, his voice cracking against the resonance. "You were one of us, Thomas Hale. You worked beside us, bled beside us, and now you serve this." For a flicker, Thomas hesitated. The carpenter's memory pressed against the thing he was becoming. He remembered hammering nails beside these men, sharing bread with their wives, lifting beams with their sons. He remembered laughter, toil, sweat, but the resonance drowned it. Thomas raised his hand. The man fired. The shot struck Thomas square in the chest. His body jerked backward, blood blooming. For an instant, he staggered, human again, fragile again. The mob survivor's face lit with hope. Then Thomas inhaled. The bullet pushed itself back out, rolling from his flesh with a wet clatter onto the ground. His wound sealed in seconds, leaving only the faint trace of blackened veins. The man's hope died in his eyes. Thomas lowered his hand, and the roots obeyed. They burst in the soil beneath the survivor, spearing through his chest, lifting him like a rag doll. His body hung there, twitching, before being dragged toward the fissure. His screams did not last. The shadow fed. With every life stolen, its form solidified further, its outline sharper, its presence heavier. What but a formless giant now grew limbs that bent at impossible angles, a spine arched like a cathedral's roof, a face without features yet more terrifying than any mask. The mob had fired their last bullet, thrown their last torch. Their rebellion had become their requiem, and as the resonance swallowed their cries, the Whitmore family sang on, their voices rising in triumph. The valley was no longer a place of earth and sky. It had become a sanctuary of resonance, a cathedral without walls, its altar the yawning fissure that bled black smoke into the heavens. The air itself pulsed like a living lung, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the Whitmore's chant. Jonathan's body bent like a reed, his spine twisted by agony and ecstasy alike. He stood at the edge of collapse, yet his voice thundered with command, weaving ancient tones through the night. Eleanor and Eve flanked him, their twin voices now indistinguishable, blending into one flawless stream of sound that made the world itself bend. Thomas stood before them, trembling, his chest heaving. Blood and ash streaked his hands, but the shadow's power hummed through his veins, intoxicating him, remaking him. His carpenter's hands, once steady from years of building homes, now trembled as though they no longer belonged to him. The cries of the dying mob echoed in his ears, but instead of guilt, he felt a deepening connection, like a cord tying him not to the people he had once served, but to something greater, something eternal. Jonathan raised his trembling hands. His eyes, bloodshot and glistening, found Thomas. "You are no longer Hale," he rasped. "The old name is dead. The shadow has chosen you. You are ours now." The twins' voices shifted, their harmony curving into a new shape. No longer a song of summoning, it was a hymn of binding. The resonance coiled around Thomas like invisible chains, lifting him slightly from the ground. His feet dangled inches above the soil as his body convulsed. The fissure smoke curled around him, seeping into his mouth, his eyes, his wounds. His back arched violently as the shadow's essence poured through him. Veins bulged black across his skin, spreading from his chest outward, as though a new circulatory system was being written into him. Thomas screamed. It was not a cry of pain. It was a cry of surrender. The Whitmore's chant rose higher. Jonathan staggered closer, placing a trembling, bloodied hand on Thomas's forehead. His voice broke, but his words remained clear. Blood binds. Ash consecrates. Shadow seals. At those words, Eleanor and Eve pressed their palms to Thomas's chest. Their nails cut into his flesh, drawing lines of blood that dripped into the soil. The ground hissed as the blood was absorbed, and the fissure widened another inch, releasing a gust of sulphurous heat. The shadow bent low, its featureless head tilted toward Thomas, as though regarding him in judgment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it reached into the fissure and withdrew something. It was a fragment of bone, long, jagged, black as obsidian, yet pulsing faintly with sickly inner glow. The Whitmore's voices fell silent. For the first time, the resonance quieted to a low hum, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. The shadow extended the fragment toward Thomas. Jonathan's eyes gleamed fever-bright. "Take it," he whispered. "Accept what no mortal has been given. Become what we were promised." Thomas's hand shook as he reached forward. For a heartbeat, his carpenter's instincts resisted. The hand that had once lifted hammers and saws now trembled at the thought of wielding something unholy. But then the shadow's voice filled his skull, drowning all doubt. "Worship me." His fingers closed around the bone. The instant he touched it, his body convulsed violently. The fragment sank into his palm, fusing with flesh, burrowing deep into bone. His scream split the night as his arm twisted unnaturally, muscles rearranging, skin cracking. The fragment became part of him, vanishing beneath his flesh, leaving only black veins that glowed faintly like embers beneath his skin. Thomas fell to his knees. His breath was ragged, but his eyes burned with new fire. No longer the eyes of a man. They glowed faintly, reflecting the shadow itself. Jonathan raised his arms high, voice breaking into laughter and song at once. The bloodline grows. The covenant deepens. The Whitmores are eternal. Eleanor and Eve collapsed beside Thomas, clutching his arms, their lips whispering the new name into his ears. Not Hale, not Carpenter, not even Whitmore. A name lost to mortal tongues, but bound to the shadow forever. The ritual was no longer summoning. It was enthronement. Thomas Hale was dead. In his place, a new son of shadow was born, and the valley trembled with worship. The valley fell into silence, not the silence of peace, but the suffocating stillness that comes after the last scream has been swallowed. Smoke drifted above the ruins of the Whitmore estate, mingling with the night air in heavy, choking curtains. The earth was slick with blood, the trees split and twisted, their roots soaked in human sacrifice. Within that silence, the Whitmores sang softly to themselves, a low hum that resonated like a lullaby for the dead. Thomas knelt among them, his hands trembling, his skin marked by glowing black veins that throbbed with each beat of his heart. He was no longer a carpenter. He was no longer a man. He was something remade. But outside the valley, beyond the reach of the resonance, there were still eyes that watched. A handful of survivors had fled far enough to escape the roots, far enough that the resonance became a dull ache instead of a deafening roar. They crouched in the forest's edge, hidden in the undergrowth, their torches long extinguished. Dirt streaked their faces, their eyes wide with terror. They had seen enough to understand one truth. The Whitmores had ceased to be human. One man, his arm broken from a fall during the escape, whispered hoarsely to the others, "We can't go back. Not ever. That land is theirs now." Another woman, her face scratched raw from brambles, shook her head violently. "No, people must know. The town must know. If we leave this to silence, they'll spread. They'll come for us, for our children." The others exchanged hollow stares. To speak of what they had seen felt dangerous, as if the very act of putting it into words would summon the shadow to their hiding place. Yet they also knew that silence would be complicity. So, limping, broken, and bleeding, they fled into the night. Days later, they stumbled into the neighboring town. Exhausted, half-mad, some delirious with fever, they spoke of what had transpired at the Whitmore estate. They spoke of Jonathan's chanting, of the twins' unholy hymn, of Thomas's transformation, of the shadow that had taken flesh and walked among them. But their words found no comfort. Some townsfolk recoiled in disbelief, insisting it was the madness of grief, the hallucinations of those who had seen too much death. Others crossed themselves and muttered prayers, refusing to let such horrors take root in their minds. A few, however, listened too closely. They leaned in when survivors whispered of the bone fragment, of the fissure, of the way the shadow chose Thomas. And in their eyes, curiosity flickered where fear should have been. The survivors begged for the land to be abandoned, for the ruins to be sealed, for no man or woman to set foot in the valley again. They cried that the Whitmores were no longer flesh and blood, but vessels for something ancient, something unholy. But humanity is a creature of contradiction. Even as some prepared their belongings to flee further west, others whispered in taverns and churchyards. They spoke of the power the Whitmores wielded, of the fire that could not consume them, of the bullets that could not kill them. They spoke of the shadow's gift and how it could be taken, not just by bloodline, but by devotion. In hushed corners, the Whitmores' ritual became a kind of scripture, words twisted and reshaped as they traveled from mouth to mouth, each retelling carrying both fear and awe. For some, it was a tale of warning. For others, it was temptation. By the time weeks had passed, the Whitmores had become more than a family. They had become a myth, a living curse, a name whispered in dread, not only in their valley, but in towns miles away. Farmers refused to till near their land. Hunters avoided the forest. Mothers hushed their children at night with a single warning: do not wander near the Whitmores. But among drunks, outcasts, and the desperate, the whispers grew darker. They said the Whitmores had unlocked a covenant with something beyond death. They said Thomas Hale had been remade not by blood alone, but by faith. And if the shadow could choose him, perhaps it could choose others. The legend of the Whitmores spread like wildfire, and as it spread, the shadow's hunger deepened. For every tongue that spoke its name, for every mind that dreamed of it, the fissure pulsed faintly in its valley crypt. The Whitmores had not only survived, they had been enthroned in story, etched into memory, immortalized in terror. The survivors had fled to warn the world. Instead, they had become its first evangelists. Years passed, yet the valley never healed. The trees that had split beneath the resonance did not grow back. The soil remained blackened, as though scorched by a fire that no rain could quench. Birds refused to nest there, and the deer that once moved in herds avoided the land entirely. The forest itself seemed to recoil, leaving the valley like a wound that would never close. The Whitmore estate lay in ruins, its charred timbers jutting like broken teeth against the sky. Yet even in its ruin, the place breathed. On nights when the moon hid, a faint glow would rise from the fissure, casting long, writhing shadows across the ground. Travelers who strayed too close claimed to hear whispers rising from the soil, faint and beckoning. And people came. At first, they were drawn by fear. Curious men and women from nearby towns, eager to prove themselves braver than the superstitions of their neighbors, slipped into the valley with lanterns and mocking laughter. Few returned. Those who did never spoke of what they saw, and their silence only sharpened the rumors. Then came the desperate. Widows who had lost their husbands in wars, parents mourning children claimed by fever, the poor who had nothing left but hunger. They came to the Whitmore ruins with trembling hands, believing the stories that whispered of power, of resurrection, of eternal life. The Whitmores were waiting. Jonathan, though his body had grown frail with age, had not weakened. His skin sagged, his beard grew white, but his eyes burned brighter than ever. Eleanor and Eve, untouched by time, stood at his side, their beauty as sharp and terrible as it had been on the night of the massacre. And Thomas, the Shadow's chosen son, towered among them, his veins still pulsing black with the bone fragments glow, his presence radiating authority that could not be denied. They received the pilgrims as priests will receive supplicants at an altar. Jonathan would speak in a voice both ragged and commanding. You come seeking, you come hungry, but hunger must be proven worthy. The Whitmores never promised salvation. They never spoke of kindness. Their gift was pain, and their blessing came with blood. The pilgrims who entered the ruins were given trials, rituals of ash, fire, and sacrifice. Some were buried alive for days in the soil, forced to breathe the smoke of the fissure until visions overtook them. Others were commanded to carve symbols into their own flesh, feeding the ground with their blood. Most died. Those who survived were changed. Their eyes grew dark, their dreams filled with whispers. They became bound to the family, not by bloodline, but by devotion. They carried the Whitmore's gospel beyond the valley, speaking in taverns and churches, weaving the story deeper into the fabric of fear. Soon, the pilgrims came not in ones or twos, but in dozens. Bands of the desperate made their way across states, following nothing but rumor and shadow. The Whitmore Valley became a destination, a place of pilgrimage of broken, the forsaken, the curious who no longer feared damnation. And with each new supplicant, the fissure grew. The shadow's presence spread, faint at first, a sickness in cattle, a rot in crops, storms that came without warning. Entire villages whispered that the land itself was turning against them. Priests thundered from pulpits that the Whitmores had become a blight upon creation. Yet even the church could not keep its flock from wandering toward the valley, because where faith offered hope, the Whitmores offered certainty. They did not promise heaven. They promised transformation. Jonathan preached it as though it were scripture. Your God asks you to wait until death for his kingdom. Our God offers eternity now. And the desperate listened. The ruins became not just a home, but a temple, a church of shadows, where hymns were moans, where sacraments were carved into flesh, where communion was taken in ash and blood. The Whitmores stood as its unholy saints, their family no longer bound by human time, their name spreading far beyond the valley. And in the shadows beneath the ruins, the fissure widened, the shadows stirred. The pilgrims believed they were coming to be saved, but in truth, they were only feeding the hunger of the dark. The whispers of the Whitmores could no longer be ignored. By the time 2 decades had passed since the night of the valley's rupture, their name had grown into a curse that stretched across states. Entire towns spoke of them in trembling voices, warning travelers not to follow the road west. Farmers abandoned their fields when the soil turned black. Priests thundered warnings of damnation from their pulpits, condemning the family as heretics, witches, and abominations against God. But the church knew that sermons alone would not stop them, nor could the state afford to let such a legend grow unchecked. Too many families were leaving their parishes behind, vanishing into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Some believed they found salvation among the Whitmores. Others were found years later, starved and half-mad, wandering roads with strange carvings etched into their flesh. In 1856, a joint decree was issued. The valley would be purged. The church sent its most devout, a small band of priests hardened by exorcisms, men who had seen demons in hovels and burned witches at stakes. The state answered with soldiers, armed with rifles and bayonets, carrying lanterns to burn whatever they found. Together, they rode west under banners of both cross and flag, convinced that their alliance of heaven and law would be enough to eradicate the family stain. But the Whitmores had been waiting. The valley did not greet the priests and soldiers with silence. It sang. Lo, guttural hymns rose from the ruins before the riders even set foot on the blackened soil. The earth trembled faintly beneath their boots, the trees groaning as though alive. The air stank of ash and iron. The first to falter were the horses. They bucked and screamed, refusing to step closer to the ruins. Some reared so violently that they broke free, vanishing into the forest, their riders left sprawled in the dirt. The priests pressed forward on foot, clutching their rosaries, muttering prayers that shook in their throats. From the shadows of the ruins, figures emerged. Not soldiers, not Whitmores, pilgrims, dozens of them, their skin scarred with the carvings of ritual, their eyes glassy with devotion. Some held crude weapons, knives, rusted axes, farming tools sharpened to points. Others carried nothing at all, save for the mad grin of those who no longer feared death. The priests raised their crosses. The soldiers lifted their rifles. Then the hymn began. The Whitmores did not appear at first. It was their congregation that sang, a chorus of broken voices, wavering, cracked, yet woven together into something terrible. The resonance shivered across the valley, like a blade drawn across bone. The soldiers clutched their ears, one collapsing to the ground with a scream as blood leaked from his nostrils. Jonathan stepped forward from the ruins, his frail body draped in black robes, his white beard fluttering in the unnatural wind. Yet despite his age, his voice carried with the strength of a man half his years. You come with your rifles. You come with your crosses. But you do not understand. This is not your land. This is not your war. This valley has been claimed. He lifted his hand, and the pilgrims surged forward. The soldiers fired. Bullets tore through flesh, and still the devotees advanced, some falling, others staggering forward with wounds that should have killed them. The priests shouted prayers, splashing holy water upon the ground, but the soil only hissed, as though mocking their rituals. Then came the Whitmores themselves. Eve and Eleanor stepped from the ruins in unison, their gowns untouched by dust, their faces ageless, their eyes burning like coals. They did not raise weapons. They did not need to. Their voices joined to him, and the resonance swelled to a deafening crescendo. Windows shattered in the ruins. Teeth cracked in soldier skulls. The ground itself split, vomiting smoke. Thomas emerged last. His massive frame was cloaked in shadow, his blackened veins pulsing like molten rivers beneath his skin. He carried no weapon but his hands, which he raised to the sky. The fisher answered, spewing forth a roar of wind that sent rifles flying from soldiers' grip. The battle became a slaughter. The congregation tore into the soldiers with animal fury, hacking and tearing with blades, claws, and teeth. Priests were dragged screaming into fisher's smoke, their prayers silenced as their bodies were swallowed whole. The hymn never faltered. It only grew stronger, fueled by each drop of blood spilled upon the soil. By dawn, the banners of church and state lay in tatters, stained in the valley mud. The Whitmores stood unbroken, their congregation kneeling before them in reverence. Jonathan raised his hands and spoke, his voice carrying beyond the valley, carried on the wind itself. Your God has abandoned you. Your kings have no power here. This land belongs to us. And for the first time, the world outside realized the truth. The Whitmores were no longer a family. They were an empire. The purge was meant to be the end. Priests had promised their flock that the Whitmores would be annihilated, their valleys salted, their very name erased from history. But when word returned, not a victory, but a silence, it spread like a plague. No messenger rode back. No triumphant hymn of salvation was sung. Only a single horse, riderless and bleeding from the eyes, staggered into a nearby town before collapsing dead in the street. Its saddle bore the emblem of the church. The truth seeped into the countryside by whispers. Families of soldiers waited weeks for letters that never came. Priests grew pale, dodging questions from their congregations. At last, one desperate survivor stumbled eastward, crawling into a village tavern with half his jaw missing, his flesh scarred with strange symbols carved by knives. His voice was broken, but his words chilled all who heard them. They sang, and the earth obeyed. From that moment, the Whitmores were no longer simply a rumor. They were a contagion. Fear did not stop the spread. It only quickened it. Towns on the outskirts of the valley emptied overnight. Families abandoning farms that had been tended for generations. Entire streets stood silent, shutters drawn, doors swinging in the wind. The soil in those places grew fallow, the wells ran sour, and wolves returned to hunt the deserted fields. The land itself seemed eager to erase those who had fled. But not all chose to run. Some chose to kneel. In distant states, whispers turned into gatherings. In basements of crumbling churches, in barns lit only by single candles, men and women met in secret. They spoke of the Whitmores not as devils, but as saviors, voices who could command the earth, who could silence death itself. They believed the family had torn open the veil and glimpsed the truth of creation, something both the church and the state had sought to suppress for centuries. These worshippers carved sigils into their flesh, crude imitations of the scars seen on the valley pilgrims. They sang in hushed tones, their hymns broken but desperate, hoping their voices would reach the Whitmores across the miles. Some vanished after such rituals, their homes left abandoned with only strange symbols burned into the walls. Others went mad, wandering streets and screaming songs no one else could endure to hear. The church tried to smother these cults, burning their meeting houses, jailing their leaders. But faith has always thrived in darkness, and the Whitmores had birthed a faith that fed not on hope but on fear. Even the state faltered. Armies refused to march west again, soldiers deserting en masse when whispers of the valley reached their barracks. Some swore they had heard the resonance in their dreams, a low hum shaking them awake at night, as though the Whitmores were calling to them across the plains. And far in the valley, Jonathan Whitmore sat in the ruins, his body frail, but his voice unbroken. Around him, Eleanor and Eve walked among their swelling congregation, placing their hands upon the foreheads of new pilgrims who had arrived barefoot, bloody, and eager to serve. Thomas patrolled the edge of the fissure like a sentinel, his shadow stretching across the fields as if claiming them inch by inch. The family did not seek converts. They did not ride east to conquer. They did not need to. The world was already coming to them. And as the cults multiplied in secret corners of cities and towns, as the priests faltered and the soldiers fled, one truth began to spread like a poison to the American heartland. The Whitmores were not a family to be defeated. They were a prophecy unfolding. The valley was no longer their prison. It had become their throne. Though the Whitmores rarely left the blackened ruins, their voice carried outward through those who worshipped them. What began as whispers in barns and basements transformed into a network of shadows, a cult that moved unseen among cities, towns, and villages. They called themselves the choir, and like a choir, their voices did not act alone. At first, they gathered only to sing. In candlelit rooms, hidden cellars, or abandoned mills, they would chant the fractured hymns that once echoed from the valley. The sound was uneven, trembling, broken by human frailty, but sometimes the resonance would catch. Doors would rattle on their hinges. Windows would crack in their frames. And the faithful would weep, convinced they had touched the edges of something eternal. But devotion is never content to remain quiet. Soon, the choir began to act. In 1861, a church in Baltimore collapsed during midnight mass. Survivors swore the walls had shaken not from storm or fire, but from the sound of a hymn carried on the wind. Weeks later, in Philadelphia, a boarding house was found abandoned. Its residents vanished, its walls scratched with sigils of the valley. Across the Midwest, farms were discovered burned, their animals slaughtered, the word claimed etched into barn doors. No law could trace these acts to the Whitmores. No soldier had marched from the valley to carry them out, yet the signs were unmistakable. Wherever terror took root, wherever whispers of the resonance were heard, the mark of the family was present. Jonathan had found his empire not in the soil, but in the minds of men. Letters began to surface in the possessions of captured cultists. They spoke of instructions, dreams sent from the valley, visions in which Jonathan's voice told them where to go, what to do, and whom to destroy. Some letters spoke of Eve and Eleanor, their beauty described as blinding, their touch leaving scars that glowed in the dark. Others mentioned Thomas, the sentinel, commanding them to carve fissures in the earth with fire, as though to mirror the valley's wound. The choir did not see themselves as criminals. They believed they were soldiers, carriers of the resonance, harbingers of a world where death would kneel. And the state began to tremble. Cities tightened their curfews. Governors begged the church for help, but the priests who had survived the first purge refused to march again. Many of them had gone mad in their cloisters, covering their cell walls with symbols and muttering broken prayers that ended in sobs. Others fled the cloth entirely, vanishing into obscurity, their faith shattered. Meanwhile, the Whitmores thrived. From his throne of ruin, Jonathan no longer needed to speak loudly. His congregation carried his words outward like veins, spreading into the world beyond the valley. Each night, more pilgrims arrived, farmers, widows, deserters, children. They came barefoot, starving, delirious, their bodies already marked with scars and symbols. Some had walked hundreds of miles, claiming they'd been called by a voice that hummed in their dreams. The valley swallowed them whole, and as their numbers grew, so too did the reach of the Whitmores. The choir became less a rumor and more movement. They walked unseen, hidden in plain sight, carrying with them the hum of the hymn, waiting for the signal to raise it in unison. And in cities where order once ruled, a terrible question began to spread among the people, one that no priest or governor could answer. If the Whitmores could reach this far without ever leaving their valley, how far could they go if they chose to march? It began as coincidence. A fire in St. Louis, swallowing an entire district of warehouses. A school in Cincinnati where the children were found singing a hymn no teacher had taught them. A mass disappearance in Richmond. 49 people gone from their homes in a single night, their doors locked from the inside, their meals still warm on the tables. The papers called them tragedies, accidents, misfortunes. But beneath the thin veil of denial, the pattern was too precise to ignore. All of it happened on the same night, at the same hour, across states separated by hundreds of miles. And witnesses spoke of the same thing. A hum in the air, low and heavy, as though the earth itself was a tuning fork struck by an unseen hand. The choir had acted. No one ever proved how the cult had communicated across such distances, or how they had orchestrated their chaos so flawlessly. There were no telegraphs, no riders, no meetings, only a shared voice that echoed in their minds, pulling them into rhythm with one another like instruments in an orchestra. When dawn broke on that morning, America was no longer the same country. The illusion of safety had cracked. In Boston, a family of 7 was found kneeling in their home, their mouths sewn shut with coarse twine, their eyes wide open, staring at nothing. In Chicago, the river ran red with the carcasses of pigs, thousands of them dumped into the current by unseen hands. In New Orleans, entire cemeteries were unearthed in a single night, coffins pulled to the surface, as if the dead had clawed upward at some unheard call. None of these places lay near the valley, yet all bore the Whitmore signature. Jonathan had found his method of war. It was not conquest by sword or rifle. It was conquest by terror, by resonance, by synchrony of dread. He had discovered that one family, one valley, could ripple outward like a stone cast into a vast pond, circles spreading farther and farther until they reached every shore. And the state began to collapse under the weight of panic. Trains left half empty as passengers refused to board them, fearing the hum would follow them down the tracks. Schools closed their doors indefinitely. Markets emptied as families hoarded food, preparing for a war that no one could see, but everyone could feel. Priests climbed their pulpits to condemn the Whitmores, but their words rang hollow. Many of their own congregants had already begun to vanish, drawn to hidden meetings in the night. Some churches were found empty, their pews overturned, their hymnals shredded. Others burned outright, flames consuming the steeples as the sound of singing echoed from the shadows. And in the valley, the Whitmores watched the chaos unfold like farmers watching a field grow wild. Eleanor walked among the pilgrims, smiling faintly at the news brought in from afar. Eve kept records, scraps of parchment marked with cities, dates, and names, her ink-stained hands trembling with excitement. Thomas sharpened his blade, though he had not needed to use it in years. The world was tearing itself apart, without a single Whitmore setting foot beyond the fissure. Only Jonathan seemed calm, seated in silence, his hollow eyes reflecting firelight. He no longer had to raise his voice. The choir was singing for him, and the nation was listening. By autumn of that year, one truth had become undeniable. The Whitmores were not waiting for the world to come to them. They had already gone to war. For years, the government had dismissed the Whitmores as superstition, a story for children and lunatics. But superstition had become smoke rising from burned cities, rivers clogged with carcasses, and families vanishing into the night. By the winter of 1862, Washington could no longer deny it. The president himself received reports sealed with trembling signatures, generals describing regiments unwilling to march at night for fear of hearing the hum, governors admitting their citizens were abandoning towns in droves, and detectives confessing that suspects claimed their orders came not by letter, not by word, but by dream. A phrase began to circulate among officials in hush meetings: the unseen war. For though no army in uniform had marched, no flags raised, no cannons fired, the destruction was real, measured in burned homes, emptied villages, and terrified citizens. And the epicenter of it all, every whisper agreed, was the valley of the Whitmores. But how does a nation fight an enemy it cannot reach? The valley had already swallowed soldiers once. The scars of that campaign lingered in the records, bloody and inconclusive, whole units erased, priests returned broken. And so the government turned to secrecy. A council was formed, unannounced, its members drawn from the military, the clergy, and the scientific elite. They met in underground chambers, lit by gas lamps, the sound of boots and whispers echoing off stone walls. Their purpose was simple: to end the Whitmore threat before it spread beyond America's borders. From their first meeting, the council recognized one thing: they could not rely on brute force. The choir was too vast, too hidden, its roots buried in cities across the nation. To strike openly was to ignite hysteria. Instead, they spoke of surgical action, infiltration, assassination, containment. And so, Project Ashenvale was born. It was to be a campaign unseen, a shadow war against the shadows. Agents were selected not for loyalty alone, but for their willingness to abandon their identities, to vanish into the same darkness they hunted. They were trained to resist the hum, sealed in chambers of silence for weeks at a time until their minds cracked and healed into something harder. Priests taught them wards and counter-hymns, rituals scavenged from the ruins of old churches. Scientists provided tinctures, powders, and devices meant to disrupt resonance, though most of them broke or killed their subjects during testing. The government accepted the losses. Better men broken in training than consumed in the valley. Each agent was given no name, only a number. Their faces were erased from records. Their existence was denied even to their families. They would march into the valley not as soldiers, but as phantoms, and their purpose was clear: to sever the Whitmore line. Yet already cracks ran through the plan. For each man and woman recruited, there were whispers that they had been seen by members of the choir, followed home, stared at in the street. Some disappeared before training even ended, leaving only bloodied walls and a faint smell of smoke. Others confessed they had dreamed of Jonathan Whitmore, who smiled and asked them kindly to lay down their weapons. Still, the council pressed forward, for if they delayed, there might soon be no country left to defend. And so, in the dead of winter, with the land frozen and the rivers stiff with ice, the first wave of agents prepared to descend into the valley. They carried with them scripture rewritten as weapon, science twisted into desperate contraptions, and a silence that was meant to shield their minds from the hum. They believed themselves ready. They were not. They moved at night, cloaked in silence, their boots muffled with cloth, their faces hidden beneath hoods that bore no insignia. The agents of Project Ashenvale carried no banners, no flags, no drums. They carried only weapons wrapped in oilskin, vials of black tinctures, and pages of scripture etched with iron nails to keep them from crumbling in the damp. Their orders were simple: enter the valley, locate the Whitmore homestead, and end the bloodline. But the valley was no longer a place. It was a presence. The moment they crossed its threshold, a heaviness fell upon them. The air seemed thicker, as if every breath were drawn through water. The ground was soft, spongy, unwilling to bear their weight. Trees leaned inward as though eavesdropping, their branches interwoven above like the ribs of a cage. The agent said nothing, for silence was their shield. Their training had taught them. No word spoken aloud, no stray melody hummed, lest the choir hear them. And so they crept deeper, their hearts beating louder than their footsteps. The first sign of failure came at dawn. Agent 17 collapsed without sound. His eyes rolled back, his lips moving though no words emerged. When his comrades pried open his mouth, they found his tongue had been bitten clean through. His throat vibrated with something that was not a voice, as though another used his body as an instrument. They buried him quickly, without prayer. They dared not linger. By the second night, 3 more were gone. One simply vanished from his post, his rifle laid neatly on the ground, his boots standing upright beside it as if he had stepped out of them. Another was found dangling from a tree branch, his body swaying gently though no rope was around his neck. The third remained seated by the fire, his eyes open and weeping blood, his hands clenched around a locket none had ever seen before. The agents pressed forward, but their silence had already betrayed them, for though they spoke no words, their thoughts were not their own. Dreams crept into their minds as they slept, dreams of Jonathan Whitmore standing before them, his hollow gaze piercing through their defenses. He never spoke, but they understood him. Why fight? Why struggle? The hum is mercy. The choir is peace. When they awoke, some could not recall their own names. Others muttered fragments of hymns before realizing their mistake and biting their lips until they bled. On the third night, they saw it, the Whitmore homestead. It did not rise from the valley so much as bleed into it. The house seemed both ancient and unfinished, its timbers warped, its windows gaping like wounds. Smoke curled upward from a chimney that had not burned wood in years. Lights flickered behind curtains, though no flame could be seen. And at the threshold, a woman stood, Eleanor Whitmore. Her face was pale, ageless, framed by a curtain of black hair. She did not move, did not breathe, yet her presence filled the clearing as if the valley itself were bowing to her. The agents froze. Their training told them she was a target. Their orders told them to strike. But their bodies refused. Muscles locked, eyes burned, and from somewhere within the house, a low vibration began, deep as thunder, steady as a heartbeat. The choir was waiting. One of the agents, perhaps braver, perhaps more broken than the rest, raised his rifle. His shot cracked the silence, a flare of defiance against the hum. The bullet never reached her. It turned in the air, as though caught by unseen fingers, and fell harmlessly at Eleanor's feet. She did not flinch. She only smiled, and then the valley sang. The sound was not loud. It did not need to be. It was low, a resonance that entered the agent's bones and hollowed them out. Teeth rattled loose. Eyes bulged. Minds split open. Some screamed, though they heard no sound emerge. Others laughed until their lungs gave out. When it ended, only a handful remained standing. They had failed. And worse, they had been noticed. Eleanor stepped back into the house, and the door closed without a sound. Jonathan was waiting for them inside. The surviving agents, no more than 6 of the original 20, stood in the clearing, trembling before the house. Their rifles felt like toys, their wards like scraps of meaningless paper. Yet their orders still clung to them. Enter, destroy, end the Whitmore line. It was not courage that drove them forward, but despair. To remain outside was to wait for the valley to finish its work. To step inside was at least to choose their own death. The door opened for them. No hand turned the knob. No hinge groaned. It simply swung wide as though the house itself had grown impatient. Inside, a warm glow spilled across the threshold, inviting, deceptive, against their training, against their fear. The agents entered. The air was different inside. Lighter, warmer. The oppressive weight of the valley seemed to lift, replaced with a strange calm that was more unsettling than the dread. The house smelled faintly of bread, of herbs, of wood smoke. It was a lie, but a convincing one. They passed through the foyer into a hall lined with portraits. The paintings stared back at them, faces pale and elongated, eyes blackened, mouths painted in shapes that suggested both song and scream. Each portrait seemed to lean forward as they passed, as if listening. Agent 9 whispered prayer, breaking the silence. His lips trembled on the words. He did not finish. A door opened on its own, revealing a parlor. Candles flickered upon a long table. Seated around it were children, dozens of them. They were silent, their small hands folded neatly in their laps, their eyes glassy and unfocused. None breathed, none blinked. The agents did not move closer. Then, From the head of the table, Jonathan Whitmore rose. He looked unchanged from the descriptions whispered through the years, tall, hollow-eyed, with skin so pale it seemed translucent. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he carried the weight of centuries. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. Instead, the walls themselves vibrated with his presence, though it groaning like an organ pipe. The agents raised their weapons, but as the barrels aligned with Jonathan's chest, the children turned their heads in unison. Not fast, not sudden, just a slow, synchronized pivot, their eyes locking onto the intruders. Agent 3 fired first. His bullet shattered a candle, plunging part of the room into darkness. Jonathan did not flinch. Instead, the children opened their mouths. The sound that followed was not a scream, nor a song. It was both. A single, unified tone poured from their throats, a resonance so pure it made the chandeliers tremble. The agents staggered back, blood leaking from their ears. Their wards burst into flame. One man collapsed, clutching his head as a skull cracked under vibration. Jonathan stepped forward and scathed. His gaze swept across the intruders, and in that moment, each of them saw something different. One saw his dead wife, smiling. Another saw his childhood home, burning. Another saw himself, already lifeless on the floor. It was not an illusion. It was prophecy. Desperation overtook them. The agents charged, bayonets fixed, blades drawn. They would not leave without spilling Whitmore blood. Jonathan raised his hand. The parlor door slammed shut, sealing them in. What happened next was never written in any report, for none who entered the Whitmore house that night ever returned to tell it. But neighbors swore they heard the sound, a harmony of screams and hymns, rising together into the night, until even the stars seemed to tremble. When silence returned, the valley remained as it always had, quiet, empty, patient. The house stood unharmed, and inside, at the long table, the children still sat. Only now, among them, were 6 new faces. Weeks passed before the silence in the valley was broken. When Project Ashenvale failed to report, when no coded messages returned, when no bodies washed downriver, the higher offices in Richmond began to whisper. At first, they assumed delay, then desertion. But when the families of the agents received no word, when the coded keys remained unused, the whispers deepened into dread. A second reconnaissance was considered. Maps were drawn, orders drafted. Yet when the time came to dispatch men, a sickness swept the barracks. Soldiers fell ill with fevers that no physician could trace, their throats swollen, as though some invisible hand gripped them. The operation was delayed. And in that delay, something else arrived. A letter. No courier brought it. It was found upon the desk of Colonel Abner Cross, sealed with black wax that bore no insignia. The letter smelled faintly of ash, though its parchment was unburned. Inside were no words, only a sheet of paper pressed with 6 bloody handprints. The colonel did not speak of it. He burned the letter in his hearth, but the smell of ash lingered in his study for weeks. Then came the dreams. First, among the officers, then among their families. Dreams of children seated at a table, their eyes glassy, their voices raised in unison. Dreams of a valley where the trees bent inward, where a house glowed faintly in the night. Dreams of Jonathan Whitmore, standing silent at the threshold, his gaze enough to silence prayer. Reports multiplied. Soldiers muttered hymns in their sleep. Clerks awoke with blood upon their lips from tongues bitten through. The government tried to suppress it, but suppression only spread the infection. In churches, ministers warned of a rising heresy. In taverns, drunks swore they heard music carried on the wind. In schoolhouses, children began to hum without knowing why. The Whitmore choir had grown. Not confined to the valley, not bound to house, it reached outward, through dreams, through echoes, through the faintest whisper of it harmony. Every failed attempt to destroy it had only strengthened it, had only given it more voices. Some in government argued for fire. Burn the valley, salt the earth, let nothing remain. But others, remembering the fate of Ashenvale, refused. Fire does not cleanse what cannot die, one senator muttered, his hands trembling. And so the official story became silence. The files on the Whitmores were sealed. The valley was stricken from maps. Roads that led there were left to rot, signs removed, records scrubbed. Yet silence could not undo what had been done. Because every night, somewhere in Virginia, someone dreamed of the house. Someone heard the choir. Someone awoke with a hum still vibrating in their chest. The Whitmores were not gone. They had only grown invisible. And in invisibility, they became untouchable. The choir was no longer theirs alone. It was in the marrow of the land itself. Time passed. The century turned. Wars raged. Empires rose and fell. Technology spread its grip across the land. Railroads carved through forests. Factories blackened skies. Cities swallowed farmland. Yet in the heart of Virginia, the valley endured, silent, patient, untouched. The Whitmore house still stood. It was not rebuilt, for it had never fallen. Fires swept across counties, but the flames parted before its walls. Hurricanes tore roofs from neighboring farms, but the house remained unshaken. Its windows never broke. Its timbers never rotted. And still, voices lingered. By the 20th century, the name Whitmore had become myth, not erased entirely, but transformed into rumor. One of those local legends passed between children at night, whispered around campfires, muttered in the corners of barrooms. Parents scolded their children for singing strange melodies. School teachers laughed off the stories of phantom choirs. Doctors dismissed the accounts of sleepwalkers found humming in the woods. But the records remained sealed, locked in government archives under codes that no clerk understood. And the dreams continued. During the Great War, soldiers wrote home of hearing choruses in the trenches, songs in no language they recognized, songs that made their hands tremble as they loaded their rifles. During the influenza of 1918, nurses swore patients whispered hymns even as they suffocated. The choir spread quietly, without border, without name. By the 1950s, folklorists and occultists began piecing fragments together. They found references to the Whitmores in old county ledgers, baptismal records, and fragments of censored letters. They found mention of Ashenvale, of the valley that eats men whole, of children with blackened eyes who do not breathe. And they began to suspect what the government had tried to hide, that the Whitmores were not destroyed, that their song lived on. Some tried to investigate. A group of students from Charlottesville vanished after setting out with tape recorders to capture the choir. 2 journalists disappeared in the 1970s after publishing an article titled "The House That Refused to Die." A minister who attempted to lead an exorcism in 1982 was found 3 towns away, wandering barefoot, his tongue bitten clean through. And still, the valley waited. In an age of satellites and electric lights, of machines that split atoms and rockets that reached the stars, the Whitmores endured. Their house remained what it had always been, a wound in the earth, festering but unhealed, a place where the living and the dead sang together, bound in a harmony no science could measure. The choir had become more than a haunting. It was inheritance, passed not through blood alone, but through listening, through dreaming, through remembering. Those who heard it once could never forget it. And as the modern world swelled with noise, television, radios, machines, the choir only grew stronger, its whispers weaving through static, through white noise, through the hiss between channels. The Whitmores had transcended their valley. Their song was now a part of history itself. And so we arrive at the present. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since Jonathan Whitmore first opened his house to the silence, since his children became vessels, since the valley swallowed men whole and left their screams unfinished. Time has carried us far from that night, yet the Whitmores have never left us. You see, history is not always something we bury. Some histories bury themselves inside us. They do not fade. They echo. The Whitmore choir is no longer bound by blood, or by walls, or by Virginia's soil. It lingers in memory, in stories, in the faint vibration you sometimes hear when no sound is present. It hums in the back of your mind when you cannot sleep. It is the tune you do not remember learning, yet find yourself humming in the dark. Think carefully. Has it happened to you? Have you ever woken in the night with a song still on your lips? A song you cannot name? A song you could not have invented? That is how it begins. The government tried to erase it. Scholars tried to catalog it. Priests tried to banish it. Yet the choir remains, because it is not simply haunting. It is contagion. Once heard, never forgotten. Once remembered, never silenced. And in this moment, as I have told you their story, the Whitmores have reached you too. Every detail, every image, every whisper this tale, these are not just words. They are echoes. They are invitations. The choir has always required listeners. It has always sought new voices. And now you know, perhaps, as you sit there in the dark, you notice it already. The faintest hum in your ears, softer than breath, steady as a heartbeat. It is not mine. It is not yours. It is theirs. The Whitmores are still singing. And whether you wish it or not, you are listening. Welcome to the choir. You have heard the story. You have listened to the choir. And now, a choice lies before you. If you turn away now, their song will still follow you into the night. If you remain, if you stay with us, their voices may be drowned out by others, by the shadows of history that we drag into the light, week after week. So stay. Do not walk alone into silence. Subscribe to this channel. Join the circle. Keep your lamp burning, and let the whispers come here, where you are not alone. Because the Whitmores are waiting in the dark. And when they sing again, you will want someone beside you. Until then, listen carefully. And remember, history does not rest.